night here, so I'm just going to wait for a glass of wine. Nicola will take over.
Okay.
So what we'll do is we'll give you the background first of what we're doing, yeah, to start off. So Mike and I have been working with complexity for a long time now. We have done a self-study into it, and we were interested in, through that self-study, it highlighted how we use it with the teachers and the students that we work with and how we introduce it to them. And we've tried various ways, but we've now reached a point where we're feeling a bit more comfortable with it, and we got the opportunity with a new programme that's been developed at University of Edinburgh. So in Scotland, the landscape for teacher education is changing, and the government have funded a new programme at University of Edinburgh, which is a 2-year master's programme. So what students do is they need to have a degree before they come onto the course, onto the programme, and then they will do 2 years, and at the end of it they come out with a master's qualification, so a master's in education, and they'll be fully qualified teachers. So it's a 2-year course, and the name of the course is the MSc in Transformative Learning and Teaching. So Aileen Kennedy is the lead on that programme. I was involved in developing the programme as well. Aileen has pushed back on a lot of the systems within the University of Edinburgh in terms of assessment. So we picked aspects from Alan and Tim with contract grading, looking at how we can look at assessment in different ways. So instead of a dissertation, we actually complete a professional vive at the end of their 2 years. So it's a really interesting course. We've had 30 students in the first year, which is the first year, but last year we've now into our second year. So our first years are now in second year, and we've had our second first year cohort, again of around 30 students. These students are mainly primary, but we also have students that are doing secondary English, and I think we've got one secondary maths this year. So there's an aim to make it link over the primary and secondary aspect as well, so people can have initial education in both sort of middle upper primary and early secondary, which matches what was the idea behind the curriculum in Scotland, which was this what they call broad general education, so it would stretch over. So these students are really interesting. They've got life experience, they've got background, they have gone through an interview process to get in, and it's all and Aileen interviews them along with other members of the course. So they're a really interesting group of students. They're really tuned in. The programme's designed in such a way that all the courses link together and encourage the students to critically engage with current thinking around education. One of the courses that I lead on is called Understanding Knowledge in the Curriculum. So the course is split into 3 parts. In the first part, they look at the idea of what is knowledge, what is curriculum, and integrating the curriculum. In the second part, they have input on 4 different perspectives of curriculum. So they look at it from a philosophical, sociological, policy, and philosophical perspective. And in the last part, we look at the curriculum of Scotland, and we compare and contrast it with international curriculum. So looking at New Zealand, we looked at New Zealand and Finland last year. We'll probably do the same this year. The input that Mike and I do is and when we use complexities, when we look at it from a sociological perspective. So we've taken complexity as a sociological way of looking at the curriculum. And we did it last year with the students, and we used the McMurty paper, which we'd had through working with this group. And the paper went down very well, and the students enjoyed the session last year. And then when we came to look at it again this year, we talked about using that paper again, but felt maybe we're in a place that we could use our own paper, which is the complex curriculum one, and to unpack that with the students. And so that's the approach that we took. And we did that this morning. So we did that with them this morning, and we're going to run through with you today how we did that. We had our paper as a stimulus. We then asked them initially to give us their first thought on the paper and ask us a question about it. And then we went into deconstructing the paper, and you'll see the 3 parts that we deconstructed the paper into as we talk through this. After each point of deconstructing the paper, we gave the students the opportunity to discuss the ideas we presented, and then at the end we asked them to share, to in a group discuss what they saw complex, what they visioned complex curriculum to be. And we've got some examples of some of the things that they did with us today with us to share at the end. Is that everything?
Okay.
Is there any questions about anything I've said there, or about the programme or the course?
Good.
Okay.
So what I'll do is, as Nick said, we sort of deconstructed the paper, and what we'll do is 2 things. I'll just talk through sort of the key bits. So we had 2 hours to work with the students on this, and as Nick will say later, it was a we're getting better at this, in the sense that we've been doing it for a long time. Explaining complexity to people is not that easy, and this was the first time that we'd used our own paper, and I think, and Nick will sort of present where the students came from, but it's one of the first times that we've sort of gone, yeah, they got this. So I'll just talk through, just for 10-15 minutes, some of the key stuff. Most of you will have a bit of a handle on them, but just to clarify where we were coming from in this. I might nip over to Nicola for 1 or 2 slides, because she made the slides, and I don't understand them all, and she'll talk to them a little bit better. So she'll talk to the first slide, because she talked about that. So just explain that, Nicola.
So just what we did at the start was just to give the students an overview of complexity thinking before we asked them to discuss the paper. So these are we used that quote just to kind of give them a sense of what it is. We talked about how we viewed it and how we use it. And then we just asked them to reflect on the paper and come up with some questions. Do you want me to do that? Some questions?
No, I will do that at the end.
The questions. So
just tell them what we've, just give that bit and I'll do the other one.
Yeah, so that's it.
Did you talk to that?
Yeah.
So,
so we used that just because, well, everybody knows it.
So we used that as a start. I mean, in a sense, looking at the audience, you'll have an idea of where we're coming from. So I won't go into these things in depth, but the first thing we looked at was the complex systems idea. And I think increasingly, as we try to explain this, it's this notion of systems are everywhere, and the key bit is this difference between complicated systems and complex systems. And it's just this main idea that complicated systems are pre-programmed and all the bits come together and create some level of certainty. Whereas probably, I suppose from a genetic perspective, there must be an element of humankind that is genetic or pre-programmed in some way, maybe not hardwired, but certainly there are elements of what we're able to do that allow us to be self-organizing. And that's the main point. And of course, that's an important point for these students to grapple with, just that idea to begin with. And again, the main point sort of stemming from that is that some of those behaviors they're not certain, but they're pretty probabilistic as the parts of our system interact, but some of them can potentially be very unpredictable. So our starting point here is the idea of the complex system being different from the complicated system, and out of that we get behaviors that are more likely and other behaviors that are more unpredictable. I won't put it on, but we used Hanoi. What was it? Hanoi. It was Vietnamese traffic. And if you've ever seen that, it's just amazing as all these bikes and everything somehow make order out of absolute chaos. Do I need to show it, do? No. So, and then in terms of from the paper, and I won't talk through this unless you want to talk through it later, but I suppose for us, the biggest thing is being able to explain what in essence are about 6 or more different tenets in such a way that the students don't get completely turned off.
And it's interesting because last year, using the McMurtry paper, we gave the students the sections of the McMurtry paper to look at the tenets and the terminology that they used. Then we shared with the students how we used that terminology, and it worked fine. And the students understood it last year. And Aileen was commenting on how they used it in other courses, and they used it in their assessment last year, a number of them. But we felt this year that we wanted to give them the open opportunity to think about these tenets, but we didn't explain them. We put them there, asked them to work out what they thought they meant, and then we explained that we would unpack them as we discussed the paper.
And I don't, I'm not sure how well they understood all of these, but they certainly were asking reasonably good questions. And I suppose the bottom one about recursive elaboration is that my expectation is that if we really want to get complexity embedded as part of the culture of thinking, these are key terms that people are going to have to visit and revisit. So as a one-off, I think the students sort of got it, but I think if we pushed them on it, it would probably be a bit more difficult. Yeah. So I won't talk to these, but what we then started to say is that here are the key tenets that we're working with, and then looking at the idea of learning as a complex process. And the work that we've been doing for quite a while now starts off, and I suppose from a personal perspective, I started to make sense of the complexity of the world by using this ecological model, which really comes from the motor control area and Gibson and et cetera, and this interaction between the individual, the task, and the environment. And I think as a starting point, I suppose each time I go back to it, I think it's interesting that it really highlights the relational aspect. And where we were really talking today was about this complex nature of curriculum, where it's not just about stuff, it's not just about content, but in context, it's about the individuals that you've got in front of you, where they are, what they bring to the table. It's about the task, which is about the learning and the way we go about that learning, and also the environment within which everything is happening. What was interesting today was that the students really seemed to catch on to that very, very quickly. And I suppose from our perspective, this gives us a really big picture idea of complexity, task, individual, and environment, and trying to go over this idea that learning is this ongoing interaction between learners, learning task, and environment, and therefore for these people or for us as teachers or as lecturers, it is what are the bits within there that we are able to have some sort of control over, that we can actually start to manipulate over an extended period of time. And I think today we were really happy with the way the students responded to that. I'll let Nick talk to the next slide because she made it.
This is just trying to summarise for the students this part of the paper to say the bits that were really important, thinking about learning as a complex process, that we need to think about the starting points and that's different for each learner, and each learner will engage in a different way. And that's where we're trying to unpick as well. And we used the example of the certainty around the use of learning intentions and success criteria in schools, and particularly in Scotland, and that it's not necessarily that certain, and that we need to think about the different starting points the children are and what they're going to take from it in different ways. So linking with ideas about self-organisation again. Then thinking about learning in terms of recursive elaboration, that it's ongoing, that it's iterative, and that's how we revisit for deep learning. So that it's not just about doing a one-off, it's about going forward and then looking to come back and applying the learning in a range of contexts, and emphasising that, because we were talking about the current context in Scotland that really doesn't support that. It's about pushing through, ticking boxes, which doesn't allow that time for revisiting aspects. Then emphasising that behaviour is emergent through this whole process, that we need to think about starting points, we go backwards and forwards, the behaviour and the learning emerges, and emphasising the need to think about error, consolidation and challenge, that there are times when we need to consolidate, there are times when we need to challenge, and that we can actually learn from making errors and use errors as an approach to our pedagogy to teach through. And we had some nice footage that we came to later, actually, that from school contests that we've got in Scotland. And this is where we started to talk about ambiguous boundaries and edge of chaos, which leads into where we went next.
So the key point, I suppose, up till now is that our starting point is what's complexity, what's that lens, and what does that look like in relation to the idea of learning within the context, I suppose, of the school. And that led us then to the idea of designing learning tasks from a complex perspective. And the last point that Nicola made about the idea of boundaries, I think became really, really important and becomes really important as part of the narrative. So I'm going to talk a little bit just about the idea of boundaries, the idea of connections, and the idea of similarity and diversity. So I suppose the work that we've been doing, and I think this is the bit that becomes, I think certainly from us, it's been hard to get beyond the idea of all these ideas about complexity to then see it actually happening in practice. But I think working with the boundaries that we create or that are there is almost the only thing that teachers or lecturers can do, is that all we can actually do is in some way start to amend or manipulate these so that we can accommodate the idea, the coexistence. And I suppose that the more I do stuff in complexity, and Davis and Samura talk a lot about that, the idea of the coexistence of, and where we've gone is about the idea of technical efficiency, the idea of adaptability, and the idea of creativity. And I think for many, many teachers, these are almost opposites where people really, really struggle. And certainly if I go back to my early days as a teacher, it was very difficult to see how they came together. And where we've sort of ended up going and starting to discuss at the moment is that if we make the boundaries very narrow and there are few options for the learner, that tightens everything and it leads to much more technical efficiency. Whereas if we open the boundaries a bit more, what then happens is that there are more options and it offers the learners the opportunity to be adaptable in their behaviours. And if we open that even further, we get the opportunity to be creative. So if I could just give an example there, if we were just talking about doing overarm throwing, which we would do with young kids, we could be very specific about where you put your feet, where you put your hands, where you turn your body, and etc. And you're trying to hit just one thing. So that narrows the whole focus and is very much just about technical efficiency. By opening the boundaries, and that could be more or less the same task, but throwing at different targets and from different distances, starts to bring in the whole idea of adaptability. And then if you actually take that much further, you can really open and actually give the kids lots and lots of options to actually be creative. And therefore, by opening and closing the boundaries, we move. And I think actually we do this quite naturally in our lives. And I think teachers are actually quite competent at doing this, but maybe not bringing this sort of idea to there. So I think we started writing about technical, adaptable, creative about 15 years ago, but we didn't look at it through this complexity lens and how we can start to move the boundaries to actually help us within that. So that was the first thing about boundaries, about technical, adaptable and creative and the coexistence of those. But also, I think we can use boundaries to consolidate, challenge, and actually help children make errors and also be creative. So and this is something I've just written a wee bit about at the moment, that if we play safe within the boundaries, and that's an important part of our learning, we consolidate behaviours. And that can be adaptable behaviours, that can even be creative behaviours. That's the positive. The negative is that if we do things so often, it becomes boring. So I think one of the points that comes out of complexity really is that it's some self-organisation happens. It's neither a good or a bad thing. It is a thing, and it can be good and it can be not so good. So I don't think we should sit and try and make out that complexity is de facto the best thing since sliced bread. What it is, it's a way the world works, and that consolidation can be very positive, but it becomes boring. If we push people around the boundaries, that can be challenging, and that's helpful for learning. But if we do that for too often, and I'm looking at certainly 2 or 3 people I know here, we get very, very stressed if we're constantly challenging ourselves, and we actually end up getting knackered, and actually it starts to fall to pieces. So the boundaries are really important, and pushing the boundaries are important, and challenging is really important, but we've got to be careful with it. And for creativity, if we actually go beyond the boundaries, a couple of things can happen. We can be very, very creative, but we can also, the whole thing can break down. So I think one of the points that I'm trying to make here is that as we use these boundaries, it allows us to consolidate some behaviours. It allows us to move behaviours forward and challenge, and that challenge certainly can lead to a lot of adaptable stuff. But if we even go further, the idea of creativity is really going out there and a bit onto a limb. So the idea of boundaries and self-organisation within boundaries, I think is a really, really interesting area that I think we can more and more work about in our practice. And I suppose if you look at that bottom one, that we can still, if we give learners lots and lots and lots of options, they can still play it safe and just go to the easy option. So as these boundaries, if there's a small number of opportunities, a middle and a large number of opportunities, people can still challenge, but they can consolidate, they can challenge, and then they can go beyond the edge of chaos. And that's something I think for teachers, and I suppose there's a similar language here in a lot of the non-linear ecological type stuff that we're talking about at the moment. I've only got a couple more things, then I'll give you back to Nick. In the paper, we also talk about is that as we go through these processes, the idea of connectedness, similarity and diversity are key parts of the curriculum experience. And certainly a bit of work I'm doing with Justin O'Connor, that the idea of PE being locked into the gymnasium and only the gymnasium, I think is problematic. And from that complex perspective, how do we develop the connections within our own subject area of physical education across the school and to the life of kids beyond the school? So there's a whole issue here about children make connections, but those connections can be negative and not meaningful. How do we actually make those experiences that we've got become much more contextually relevant and meaningful to the children and take us into the idea of deep learning? So connectivity and coherence become a key part of a complex curriculum. And then finally, and this is something that personally I've become really interested in, is this balance between aspects that are similar and bits that are diverse. So if we have a curriculum where everybody is doing the same thing at the same time in the same way, that curriculum experience becomes all about sameness. And we have a problem then that eventually our system, because it cannot actually be adaptable because everyone's just doing the same thing. Therefore, too much sameness is a problem. Diversity is a great thing, as we know, but too much diversity means that we end up completely splitting and fragmenting. So in terms of our behaviours, looking for similarity and diversity, the coexistence yet again, I think, becomes a key part. So we sort of, I think today, and I think a lot of our time, a lot of it was spent on the earlier parts of this idea of the ambiguous boundaries and technical, adaptable, creative, and consolidation, etc. We sort of touched on these bits, and these are something that I personally would like to be able to explore a bit more in the future. So I'll put you back to Nick. She'll just finish with what she said, and she'll tell you how the students responded to this.
So just finished with a quote to bring it back to knowledge again, and took this from McMurtry's paper. And this really linked as well with what we've been looking at in the course in terms of questioning knowledge and with the philosophical perspective that we looked at last week. And it's other speakers that do that. So Aileen talked to them about policy, and another member of staff talked to them about philosophical, but the links were clearly there. And it's the last bit of this quote that I brought their attention to, about the idea about knowing rather than knowledge, because it involves living processes rather than any kind of object or fact that can be considered apart from actual learners. So that kind of was where we got to, and then we asked the students to think about what this all meant for them in terms of thinking about the curriculum. And interestingly, some of the questions they raised at the start, it was interesting because some of them asked specifically about the PE context of it, and actually in a good way, that they were interested to find out about why it was in a PE context, and they actually understood some of the aspects. So some of us were asking, well, yeah, you're telling us about it from an early years perspective of the curriculum that you had. How would we envisage it for older children, primary or secondary? So they really picked up on some of these points. Then they asked them wider points about what it meant for them as in terms of teaching. So one of the group asked about how can we adapt complex thinking to the everyday routine of different classes and individuals. If there are so many external factors to take into account when implementing complex thinking, how can teachers practically use this theory? And then how can we encourage teachers, including ourselves, to take part in curriculum development process in an environment which is increasingly focused on ticking boxes? And I think a number of these questions they started to answer themselves through the session today, which was really interesting to see them doing that. So to pick out some of the key aspects that they picked up on, can you make the screen bigger? You can't.
Jessie, no.
So this is just one example of one of the groups that started. You can see there, they've gone really down the complexity route. While other groups had more of a mind map approach, you can see there. And just, I'll pull out some of the points that they put. So this group here said, do not insist on having control over everything. So they really picked up on the idea of self-organisation. This group also said, we as teachers have to realise our self-organisation within the schooling system. So a lot of them really picked up on the self-organisation point and the problem within education of for perfection and for needing to have control. This group also talked about an environment of freedom but not anarchy. Then another group picked up on some points about the adaptability aspect. So they've got here, be ready for the unpredictable, reactive, exploring emergent behaviours and being able to find teaching opportunities and not be constrained. And then another group here, this group was great. They had this idea about, and this came back to a number of them made the link to Stenhouse and the research model of curriculum design that we do in the paper. And they said, yeah, we get that. And we get actually what Stenhouse is saying seems to link very closely with what you're saying about complexity thinking. And this group we're talking about mentioned that, and then they talk about, they wrote Team David Attenborough, and they said, do you want us to explain? I said, yes, please. And they've written, as in students who are explorers, but in a safe way. And that's what we're talking about making errors in a safe context. And another group had picked up on that as well, where they've said, set up the environment based on safety and respect. reiterate these as core criterion for human interaction. Then they also said creating judgment-free environment in order for children to make mistakes happily. And they were suggesting no separate age level classrooms. So you can see the kinds of ideas that the students were picking up from what we said and starting to apply them in how they saw ideas around the school curriculum. And I think the main things they picked up on were the ideas about how it supported the idea of integrating the curriculum, the emphasis on unpredictability, and looking at learning through trial and error, about adaptability, about self-organisation, and they also picked up on the similarity and diversity.
I suppose, just to finish, the students also picked up, I think, big time about the nature of the systemic structures of schooling that constrain in a significant way. So that a lot of the ideas of self-organisation became problematic. So we had quite a few discussions about that. So although this is a one-off in that sense with these students, I think I'm certainly up now, I think, to start to take this to a wider audience, because I think people are starting to get their head around it. And it's been difficult to see how that would happen. So that's really where we are. So I think it becomes really important. How do we share our ideas about complexity with new people who are not just academics? So it has to make sense about what it looks like in the real world. And I think that's, partly what we were talking about there.
I got an email already. I had an email already from one of the students that said, I really enjoyed the session today. I found it really interesting and it really made me think. So one already. But
I think that was a student that liked me a lot more than she liked Nicola. Okay, so that wasn't a particularly great closure one, but there, that's our story. And my memory of this is that it always takes about 10 minutes for people to start speaking. But what? No.
Well, Nick and Mike, I would say first off that the McMurtry paper, that is pretty much whenever I'm talking to people that are not well aware of complexity theory, that's one of the best papers for that because of the context that it takes in. So with my graduate students, that's the one that I give them because it kind of makes the link, even though its context is within a graduate kind of seminar. It really resonates with people that, hey, this is what complexity theory is, and this is how it differs from some of our other methods of knowing. And I think that overall that's pretty interesting. I haven't, in my practice, I kind of stay away from complexity theory overall as far as my teacher ed students. I have introduced it a little bit because it kind of goes against some of their pre-notions. I don't want to hit a hiccup. I don't know, is that what you kind of experienced, that with reductionism as a major paradigm throughout our entire culture, you find that kind of as a major hiccup, even with like today in your class?
I think not with this group of students.
Okay.
This group are really open, and the nature of the program that they're doing is about activist teaching. It's about transformative learning and teaching. So they are really open to this kind of thinking already. I would say the majority of them were with us and were really following through in what we were saying and thinking about it critically. And it links in with I think the assessment ideas behind the course, really behind the program and this course help as well, because I've asked them for their assessment to create a pop-up exhibition to convey their understanding of curriculum and their vision of curriculum, and that is to be in a form other than the written form. So they'll use some written aspect to it, but it's using drama, dance, art, poetry, film essay. So this is really, they went from kind of fear initially about it to now they're absolutely enthused by it. We had a session last night and they're staying behind to keep talking about it. So this is a group of students that are really quite critically aware already.
I mean, Al, you're using complexity aren't you, with what, sort of third year students, yeah?
Yeah, that's when we typically start to introduce it, but motor learning students now are starting to get it straight away.
Yeah.
In fact, all our motor learning is now completely what Wayne and I teach motor learning, so that's why right from step one, that's all they get.
Now, Alan, when they do these type of concepts in motor learning, are they doing dynamic systems theory, or are they doing? Because there is a difference between dynamic systems and complexity theory. I mean, it's a very vague difference, but how do they go about that in those courses?
Well, in terms of our motor learning, it would be a blend. We just sort of mash everything up together. So we don't teach them dynamical systems theory and then an ecological theory or something. We give it all under the same sort of umbrella.
And how do they, I suppose the question I was going, how do you find that as undergraduates they respond to this broad brush, I suppose, complexity?
Yeah, that's what I was interested in your paper, because I was going to ask, is the presentation more about the point of entry? So how do you begin to introduce complexity to students, or is it a different set of theorizing around curriculum? But I think as I would say that, I always come back to the fact that everybody understands complexity because that's the world we live in. So it's how we try and explain that world. And I think for most students, if you come in as you have, saying, look, here's some key principles that help explain why the phenomena are so complex. And we've always tried to make sense of that complexity, but these are the tools that we're using. And especially if you try and identify, here's some more traditional ways of thinking about it, and this is where the field has moved to, most students begin to understand that. I suppose the problem for students, though, is they move away from your course and they move to other courses. You don't necessarily have a coherence between the way that you're thinking about the world and the way that other people are presenting it. And so you've got that problem. But I think that's a very traditional problem that students have to navigate as they go through.
Yeah.
I think the MSc is slightly tighter in terms of courses, so the linkage between the courses is clearer, I think, and the students pick up on that, unlike our other initial teacher education programs.
But I think your point's really, just the point just about that is that you raised the point about, is this about curriculum or is this about introducing complexity to students? And I suppose the answer to that is it's both. And it's trying to work your way, and I suppose partly for the first time that we used our own paper, going back to Jesse's point, knowing that McMurtry's paper was probably a bit more accessible, because it was about something that they could get their teeth into more easily. And it is finding that way to articulate this stuff to a wider range of wider audiences. So I suppose that's what we're talking about tonight, is that it's partly about how we're trying to envisage a complex curriculum, but also how we're envisaging sharing that with different groups of people in this complex world that we live in.
And I think that's difficult over one session. Is this an introductory session, or is this, have you built it up over time?
And that's why. So I think you've been able to do that. I think that's where we can't do that yet. And I suppose that's going to be one of our discussions: is there somewhere that we could get a complexity course going that we can start to see how, in that recursive way, that we're able to actually maybe start to track that through a bit. But like everything, we've got to start somewhere, and this was our effort today.
Okay. Can I ask you a couple of questions? When you talk about boundaries, do you think of the boundaries as constraints or as attractor systems, or as attractor states?
Probably a bit of both. And I suppose well, I think it was a bit of both in that boundaries can be, constraints or enablers, just at the terms that I don't particularly like. And I suppose that's why, but I think there's elements where the boundaries can be, let's put it another way, they can be positive things, but they can also be pretty negative things, which is maybe not exactly answering.
Right, because I like the notion that you're trying to explore the, creativity. And as you say, I think, in traditional sort of, when we teach about constraints-led pedagogy or enabling constraints, I think enabling constraints is a confusing term, but I do like the notion of creative. Sorry?
It sounds like a misnomer in the sense that, how can you have a constraint that doesn't seem to me to make any sense.
And so in a sense, I kind of like the term a creative constraint.
Yeah.
So it's tapping into what you're trying to do there as a teacher should be thinking in terms of creative constraints, and that by setting them properly, and I think, all constraints probably create the condition. That's why it's interesting what you've said. I would have thought that all constraints create the possibilities for creativity to occur. And that's why I was just a little bit confused about the boundaries, because if I say stay inside the gym and you're saying for creativity to occur, we want to go beyond the boundaries. I don't want the little buggers running around outside.
Yeah.
Stay inside the boundaries.
I suppose, just go back to that point, is that I think the word ambiguous in terms of ambiguous boundaries is that, for you, it could be the same boundary for someone else, like Jesse. For him, it could be a creative opportunity, and for you, it could be a negatively constraining boundary. So I think the word ambiguous, I think, is really, really important in not even in context, but with different individuals, the same boundary will mean different things. And that's why I think we have to acknowledge, and and I suppose it's so much of this is finding the words that are the attractor states to people and go, yeah, I get this now, and I think we have to try and sort of always use different combinations of words, and then people go, yeah, I get it now. And I've just found that a really difficult part of I think there are an awful lot of people thinking quite similarly around the world now, but using words that are different. And therefore what happens is that you're not in that club because you don't use those words. And I think that's a really, I think it's a postmodern problem that we've just got so many different ways of looking at things. Anyway, that was my rant for a third Friday night.
One of the things they stay with that, like your demonstration of widening the boundaries and constraining the boundaries and what have you, and it's linked to creativity. And it sort of evokes sort of memories of Mostyn in terms of his notion of the divergent production style. So it's just your notion of going beyond the boundaries, or how we set those constraints. And if students become complacent, I'm sort of thinking, if they're complacent, is it that they've found a solution to that problem that fits the environment, the problem environment that you've set for them? And then, so just thinking about the divergent production style, it's kind of like, as Mostyn would say, is the challenge then to say to the students, like, how many solutions can you find, or how many attractors sit inside this environment space, as opposed to changing the space, which is visually how I've seen it. You've sort of said too narrow, we don't get enough creativity. You broaden it up and you get a lot more creativity. Or is it a matter of saying, like, once you've found one solution, then trying to find me another one and another one? It's that sort of don't find the answer, find a range of possible answers. I'm just trying to conceptualize how you're thinking about the notion of, the boundaries and setting those constraints in the practical sense.
And I suppose part of, certainly me, and I can only talk for me and I can't talk, is that we're constantly opening and closing the boundaries. And going back to that ambiguous is that actually, and we've all worked with groups of people where you open the boundaries and they give you nothing. So by giving people too many options, almost like you were saying, is they take the easy way out and do nothing, or they do what they've always done. So I don't think this works. No, I think the ideas have some merit, but I think we have to obviously take this a bit further and look for this idea of when you open the boundaries, that gives more opportunities. That means there is more potential to be creative, but it's also more potential to do bugger all.
But then I like what you were saying, Alan, about the creative frames, and then I just keep trying to see it to help me see it to then explain it. So we used a video from one of the teachers that we work with in Practitioner Inquiry today, and he's done stuff before. He's done games of uncertainty, but the video today was about inclusive games. So exactly as you were describing there, Alan, he's videoed them, and it's like they're playing 15 aside at football, and he's making the point that this isn't inclusive. There's loads of them that can't play. There's loads of them not involved. There's loads of them getting cheesed off. There's loads of them at the side. So then he starts to, through his teaching, he's going, right, okay, so work just with a partner. How do you make it inclusive? How do you use this equipment, and how do you make it inclusive? Okay, and everybody has to have a say. Everybody has to be involved. Okay, let's make the group a bit bigger. What happens when we make the group bigger? And the whole video tracks this through. And it's like you're saying there about the teachers taking these constraints and playing around with them with the children to explore the learning and what it means to be inclusive and what it means to feel excluded and how that works within the game context. And the more I see it, just that's what I'm looking for now more and more when I go out in schools. And
Dr. Murray or Mats, do you have any anything?
Sure. I've got one, and it came from just perhaps if I could pull you back to your paper, and then you could bring it through what you were speaking about just now. In your paper, when you're talking about the planning of experiences, and there was the perspective of the end means, and how predetermined learning outcomes can serve a purpose. I find that interesting, and in my scenario where I'm teaching teachers to teach primary PE in London, I don't know if it's sad, but it's becoming a very modular experience, and so I feel that we're more on that side. And ironically, we're designing and I'm teaching a new PE module this term on developing creativity through physical education. And I haven't mentioned complexity, but it's all based on rules and constraints. For example, we're learning about risk-taking in the water on Monday. And it wasn't risk-taking as in hold your breath longer, but I'll be struggling to stretch their way of thinking because they're year twos, but they don't have our year one anymore because we've lost that whole first year of specialism time. So they've got a very linear way of thinking, and it takes me a lot of time to unpack that before I even provide a new concept. And I'm already struggling, and I'm thinking, geez, it's going to have to be one of those end means deliveries just to keep it safe. And for me, I mean, I try and expand and use rather and change the environment, but I just have them look at the environment as affordances and try and find different things. What would you recommend? Because as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking obviously of my own practice for Monday, let alone for beyond. But I feel like I'm already within a compromised, constrained environment. And I don't mean constraint as in a Knowles perspective constraint, which it's not negative or positive, it just is neutral. I'm saying it's actually very ends driven. And I find that quite compromising if I do want to try and expand their approach in a sort of non-linear fashion.
I think it is difficult in the constraints of the university system and working with undergraduate students, because they are conditioned and socialised into ways of thinking about schooling and education that they find it very difficult to think beyond that kind of quite linear aspect. One of the things that I talked with the students about today, and I did when I was at Strathclyde, was I had a PE option that I did, and I purposefully just made the students really uncomfortable from the start and made them play netball and just told them to play it and didn't give them much rules, and then brought them back and said, right, well, tell me about that experience. And so they felt uncomfortable, and I said good. Well, then how do you think primary age children feel if you made them do that? And then the light bulb came on, and then from there I broke it right back, and that's where we were able to then look at the importance of understanding fundamental movement skills for the basis of teaching primary physical education. And the feedback I got from the students was so positive, and it just gave them something to hang it on from the start. So it wasn't me going and preaching, they'd had that experience so they could hang it on that. So sometimes I think having some kind of experience or making an uncomfortable feeling or that learning through error can be a good end potentially.
Is it a good, do you think it's good to just start building in this language into just immediate practice when there is a sort of end-means situation going on? Because your students seem to have a little bit more conceptual space, obviously through pedagogical practice, but also by virtue of your own aspirations.
Yeah, I think if you enact it in your practice, which I try to do, I think they pick up on it. And thinking about the teachers that we work with, I think we talk about some of the terms so that they pick up on it. So one of the teachers I work with, he mentioned when we were talking the other day about it being a recursive process. So you realise that actually, if you kind of enact it and talk about it in a natural way as part of what you're doing, it does get picked up on.
So just on that, I think the idea of scenarios are I think a really interesting area for discussion, and quite a few of the sort of complexity typey books that I read are building themselves around this idea of scenarios, because then it gives you and take your point of what scenario could you set up for your students that might get them to start to think differently, and I think there's something within that, perhaps for the future.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Although not for a second were we suggesting that we are in any way experts. That was
No.
But I teach a lot of motor learning, and it just seems to be, I've never mentioned complexity, which is why I was attracted at the conference to and listening with big ears. And I find my students, I find it better just to, because I've got such a diminished time with them, I don't even talk about all theories, I just go straight to ecological, because if they've had the Schmidt or whatever and the motor development affordances, they struggle. So for me, it's just how do I have this depth when our time is shrinking? And that's quite commonplace in England at this time.
I suppose the bit is that the ecological stuff seems to be a good starting point, in the sense that it is, it is, in a sense, go back to Alan's point, everyone knows that the world's complex. I think ecological makes it just a wee bit more complex, but I don't think my own view is that complexity takes that further. It makes a bit more sense and can move forward. I just think we have to find ways of working with that.
I'm going to put a lecture in for complexity. Complexity 101, but it's going to be second year's complexity 202. But from my 101 perspective, because I'm such a novice, I'm pre-control.
But isn't the point, if if we want our students to teach using complexity theory, shouldn't we try to use complexity theory teaching our students?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
isn't that our starting point for how we should teach students? We should try to use complexity theory within our teaching, and how do we do that? Considering our time, considering the program as a whole. I think that's an interesting point to.
Yeah, I was saying to the students today. So I said to the students today is that I work at Edinburgh University. I don't think we do a good job. I think partly because of the constraints, but partly because the way we have traditionally taught students, we do not allow ourselves to look at this as a complex endeavour. And I think you're right. I think we have to find ways to include that. But I also think the other part as well is that we have to be, it certainly took us, I think, a long time to start to find ways to incorporate it in our own practice. I think we got the ideas, but it's how do you start to look at that in practice? Going back to Ali's point earlier, is that how do you start to do this within the constraints? But I think you're absolutely right, is that we have to try to model what we're trying to suggest. And I'm not sure it's that easy, because I think, there's a lot of hype about complexity, but I'm not sure how well it is applied in a world that's about outcomes.
I think that's where I think about it so much more in my practice all the time, and particularly with this course, because I feel a certain amount of freedom with it, and I really am trying to think about those learners as self. I do try to engage with the tenets in my teaching of that course, and I do think it comes through in some of the discussions I was having with the teachers, with the students today. I think that they could see that in my teaching, and I could talk about it and model it.
But I think your question is absolutely right.
Yeah.
And I think for all of us, is that we almost have to start to get some evidence of how we can share. And I suppose that's what we're trying to do today, is that much as we would as much enjoy talking about curriculum aspects, it's how do we share this with people so that they start to go, yeah, I get this, and I'm going to try and use that in my practice. And in a sense, we have to live that. We have to become the living examples of complexity, I suppose.
There's an AFP conference in March for primary education in middle of England, and my students they're going to present how they've supported their curriculum investigation through creativity. And I think I'm just so encouraged, but I'm so inspired by tonight, because I'm going to try and bring in the complexity, because I've got the knowledge underpinning. I just have to have the confidence now to take a further step, and that would be our first setup where I present with my students. The whole class is going, so I've got 18 students going to present in March, and I think I'm going to have a stab at seeing how we can articulate a little bit at a very, it sounds so novice, I'm sorry, but it would be a nice way for me to sort of get my feet wet.
Okay, Ali, I didn't hear the last, but I just heard you saying I'm so inspired by tonight. I just stopped listening.
No, but I am, and I knew that at the conference, and I'm writing a paper right now, and I was waiting for tonight. I'm just really enjoying learning so much from you guys, and it's important for my own writing, but it's also important for my own practice. And it is inspiring because it's so grounding. I just feel like with everything being diminished and constrained in my practice, this is quite liberating. But I think I'm going to because I'm a very practical person, I'm going to take a step forward and put my creativity module. I've got maybe 9 more classes with them, and take a wee bit of chunk and see if we can operationalize just a little bit. Because your paper kind of talked about curriculum and pedagogy teacher professional learning, and that last one, the perceptions of physical education, the wider. I think it might be for me to go into teacher professional learning with my class, because I've got very little control over the curriculum. I mean, we design the curriculum, but it's so many constraints, it just gets silly because they've got so few hours to learn the tenets around physical education, let alone critical thinking, complex thinking, metacognitive thinking. It's like, it just diminishes. So I think I'm going to take tonight to just start a wee blend, and if you had some advice about that, I think that would be brilliant.
And actually, I do think I haven't read it. There's a chapter in a book about transdisciplinary stuff. And go back to sort of Jess's point about the dynamical systems being dead different from complexity. It may, but I'll tell you, compared to behaviourism and so I think from a sort of theoretical perspective, the time to start to look for the similarities between different theoretical lenses is upon us now, because the more we don't do that, the more that we become, going back to the last point of what I said, the diversification becomes too great. And we've got people saying, so today we're going to talk about ecological, then next week we're going to talk about, then next week we're going to talk about, then next week. And the people that we're talking to go, I've got no idea what you're talking about. So I think it beholds us to start to look at where the connections are around that, which, to be fair, Dr. Robbins, you do reasonably well. So I thought you were asleep there. I'm
thinking, I'm listening.
All I can see was the top of your head.
Mike, that's what happened in sports sciences in Britain, and I thought it was quite refreshing for kinesiology in the US to stay quite interconnected. And in physical education in Scotland, it seems to me far more connected than PE. I just call it PE in England because it's not really physical education anymore. It's just it's different stakeholders shouting loudest. And every time I go to government now, which is exciting, everyone stands up, and I'm so confused because I don't know if they're trying to genuinely impact physical education positively or get a stake in a piece of the pie for part of the monetary, the funding from the government. And even when I took last week, I took three of my year 3 students to a conference, and they were so insightful. The students picked up straight away that it was a bit of a shark fest, and they want to advocate, and so they're going to graduate now, and I feel a little bit inept because I haven't let them leave with this language. But again, we've still got a little bit of time, and we've got seminars, and I'm going to put on one seminar for basic complexity, because I was looking at the paradoxes of active lifestyles, and that is, I mean, your Joe Harris stuff, that is quite interesting, but in actual fact, everything we're looking at is a complex issue, and it would actually be far more instrumental for them if I took a step back and said, underpinning over these, or as an umbrella, it would be the complexity of all these issues within England, because it's very political. And I don't have that understanding. I just know that everything's all about money down here.
As it is everywhere.
Well, money's time for physical education in England, and our primary teachers, most of them say, I don't have the expertise to do this. Again, it comes back to your paper. So and Griggs and Gerald talking about the expertise that we're saying other people have. But if we use this language, when you're saying how do we do this, if we start to use this as our common language, and our pre-service teachers will start to get a better understanding of the complexity is within their own praxis. It's not that complex, it's just then understanding that it's complex out there.
I think you're right, and Alison, that's what a lot of the terminology that the students picked up today, and they could relate it to what they're seeing in the classroom and their practice, and how they want to approach their practice, and how they understand what they see in the classroom. So yeah, I think that was the language was quite. They got a lot of it today.
Alison, you bring up some fantastic points there. One of them, I think, the the SINC itself has never completely grappled with, which is when we talk about complexity, what do we mean? And certainly when I've been up in Scotland with Nicola and Mike, it's been often a big discussion we've had, because I think, even listening to our language, we flick between complexity theory, complexity thinking, you see complex issues and those sorts of things. So I think even with us, there's sort of variation. And as the others have heard me say before, I think we've got theories of complexity, but we don't necessarily have a unified complexity theory. So when we talk about dynamical systems or ecological theory and what have you, they're all theories of complexity. And if we look at the sciences don't talk about complexity theory. They talk about ecology, quantum physics, and things like that. And I think my personal thing is, I think we make in the social sciences a mistake if we come back to try and have one unified thing called complexity theory. So I know that what we've talked about before is a sort of, I think there's a turn towards an understanding that the phenomena we look at is complex, and we have to revisit that. And as Jesse said at the start there, that the way we've focused on reductionism is problematic. So we're revisiting that to rethink what we mean by living in a complex world. There's also another, Joy Butler and I wrote a paper in the Physical Education Handbook about designing learning systems, which may be useful to students and may not. But I think I want to come back to when I asked Mike and Nicola about whether this was, about complex curriculum, or was it about how do you introduce this? One of the questions was, because I was wondering about the notion of what I call depth, so working across different levels. And as Alison said, when you talk about curriculum, especially at the policy level, it's really interesting that you find a space where everybody's shouting and it's about exercising power. And I don't think in your presentation you kind of addressed the relationship across levels and how important that is to curriculum. And when we're talking about playing with boundaries, you're essentially talking about two different levels in the classroom. And perhaps what needs to come out is the notion of governance, that the upper level governs what happens at the next level down by setting those boundaries, by being able to have the agency to set boundaries, and at the next level down, the self-organizing behavior of the individuals work inside those boundaries. And I was just, that's why I was sort of interested when you talk about curriculum as a form of governance over learning, whether that be another aspect that you bring in there. So, yeah. But I didn't mention that before, because if you're trying to introduce it to students, that becomes another layer of complexity that for the first time students want to hear about it is not.
Well, it's really interesting actually, because this second part of the course, which is the 4 perspectives, so they've done, the first week they did policy, then they did philosophical, now they're doing sociological and looking at complexity with us, and then next week is psychological perspective of the curriculum. And everything you mentioned there about policy, they looked at in the first week. So it was really good this week that I could then link back to the discussions that we'd had about policy and talk about it in that nested sense. And they had a real understanding and grounding in that. Aileen led the policy session, and to highlight the complexity, she did a task with them at the end where there's a game here. I think everybody has it. It's top trumps, and so she got the students to make the top trumps. So she gave them various stakeholders that the students might think might be involved in policy. So Scottish Government, Education Scotland, council, various places. And then the first thing they had to do was work out who they thought was most involved in making the policy. And that's where the complex and the layered and the nested nature of this really came to the fore. And the students really thrived on that task because it really threw up a load of problems for them and trying to work all of this out. But at the time, I thought how well it linked in with where we were going next with, in terms of philosophical and then into sociological using complexity perspective. So I could draw back on that today. So they already had that grounding, which was really good.
Mm.
But you're right, we didn't talk about it. I mean, that's you know, and it's not that it's not there, but it's certainly. I think it's always an interesting one of the students because they see their life as teachers in a sense around them, and I suppose we are adding to that. But I think the whole bit of the nature of, you know, do they implement curriculum or do they enact it? Discuss is part of that whole complexity. I think around that. So.
But if from what you've said, it would be wonderful to lift the notion of complexity to frame the course. So if you're talking about policy, then you're looking at that broader issue of how complex, as you just said. You know, it's great. And just while I think about it, because I did jot it down here, I don't know if it's possible in a space somewhere on the website or something where, you know, if we're all talking about how do you introduce this stuff to students, whether there was some digital resources that people have developed that you could just upload and, you know, and then, you know, just sort of thinking what Alison sort of said, but it's been really useful for me to see how do I, you know, what are sort of the PowerPoints and ideas and
I think
that people use to introduce it.
Yeah, I definitely can. I'll make a page for that, and we can actually make kind of a depot. It won't actually be housed on the website. It'll probably be housed like in Google Docs, but that'll be linked into the website to where you can access it. It's just kind of I think I only have 2 gigs of space on that website, but I have not infinite, but I have a lot more available to me on Google Docs, but definitely we can do that.
Yeah. I don't know if other people are like me, but I love looking through other people's ideas and borrowing, adapting, and what have you. I think, oh, I like that. I've done a nice job here. I'll copy that.
Yeah, and I think I mean there's 2 points in that. You know, we'll leave the policy bit at the moment, although I think it is a really interesting one. But I think a big thing here is how do you introduce complexity? No, how do you introduce any idea that gets people to go, shit, that's really interesting, I'd like to know more about it. And I think that, you know, so if nothing else, you know, Ali's response this evening has been the response that you would want from all these students. How do you do that? And in the sense, Alan, that's what you're saying, is how do you get the video clip that people go, yeah, I get this, and I'm starting to think about it. And I go back to your point. I don't think that complexity is a theory, and certainly not in the traditional sense. But I do think that it might be the paradigm shift, and I think that's why you talk about the shift to complexity, and I think that's the big thing, and I think it's very, very difficult to try and articulate it as a theory.
I think of that Butler, the paper Joy and I wrote, well, just briefly, and that's what we're framing some future work on, is that notion that it's an ontological shift, it's a conceptual shift, and it's a language shift. You know, and those are 3 critical sort of elements to changing our professional sort of ways of thinking.
Yeah.
But
and I suppose there's always that problem, is that these are huge, big things that you've just said that are very, you know, but it's very difficult to then get people to you know, it's very difficult to think that you're going to get other professors in physical education to buy into that shift if they've built their whole careers around a different way of thinking. So it's how do you actually start to introduce this, all these bits that you've said, and actually build some momentum and capacity over time, which, you know, and it's, I don't think it's the same as TJFU. You know, I think this is bigger, and how do you do that? And it's, you know, it's exciting, but it's feckin' frustrating.
One thing
I don't have my tea yet. I need to go soon.
one thing, just really quick, one thing that, from my perspective, complexity really embraces is the idea of acceptance of failure. That you have creativity, and from that creativity, eventually you work towards something that is more efficient or better, or however you want to phrase that. But along that way, you have a series of failures that you have to have that feedback from.
Yeah.
And so if you're teaching your students to employ a strategy like that, how do we get our students to accept that failure is a major part of it? And how
Send them to Scotland. If you're Scottish, you know all about that. No problem.
Because I would say that fear of failure is a major constraint
Yeah.
in that process of self-organization for our students.
Yeah, and if we try to look at the idea of learning being linear, by definition, that draws us to the idea of failure to not being good, or errors not being good. So there's, and I suppose logically you say, well, we don't want to make mistakes anyway, but there has to be something that we do early on in the process, make us all think that if we work hard, we will learn and we will get better, and it's linear.
Yeah.
And I think I was saying that today. We had another colleague in with us doing today, and I was saying, how do you work with 5-year-olds to get them to understand complexity? What's the language there? And that point that you've just made, Jesse, is that failing is part of the gig. You know, and how do we do that? And systemically, I think we've got a problem. That's not the only problem, but I think it's certainly part of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. How many times does a 2-year-old fail when they try to walk?
Yeah. Or how many times do you okay?
Like Mike and Nicola did talk about that, because you talked about creating an atmosphere of safety and respect, and you know, and I suppose it's those words like experimentation and, you know, and it once again goes back to Mostyn, you know, the notion of the divergent production style, and along with that, you know, we use, I love the concept of safe to fail experiments, you know, trying to put that in mind. So getting away from the notion of best practice, because I think we've drifted into this notion that there is one right way to do stuff, and you're trying to replicate that. And yet in complex situations, what you're trying to do is constantly adapt, trying to experiment, trying to test out stuff. And safe to fail, you know, I think you've picked, Mike and Nicola picked that up with it, the notion of safety and respect and challenge and what have you. That's what every good person should be doing, is we're constantly saying, okay, I'll give this a go. You know, I'll try this today, see what happens. And if it fails, it doesn't really matter. So that's the notion of safe to fail. But your notion there is, I think, a good one, Jesse, you know, accepting the failure, because our assessment systems don't build that in.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the bit. Our whole education systems are predicated on a factory system from 150 years ago, and we've not really broken away from that. Yeah. And they're linked to so many linear, you know. So the system that constrains our complex thinking is really quite severe. And go back to, you know, the point that was made about us being complex in our own practice. Our universities don't help us necessarily as well either. You know, so the whole education system is in that sense, I think, or from all of us here, pretty out of date.
Really picked up on the safety fail today.
Yeah.
They really picked up on learning from error. That was one that they really liked and felt, yeah. But they felt the school system constrained them. They said that. It just doesn't support that.
I have to rewrite a lecture because I was going to do that change, challenge, choice. You know, the physical activity by Morris and Steele and those guys. With change, challenge, choice, and be clever, and add the fourth C in creativity. Now I've got to do change, challenge, choice, creativity through complexity. The 5 C's.